Gazier in real life, Steven Zootfly here in Second Life. And as a component of the class, each student is to design and have a science communication project, which can take one of many formats. And Gray is one of the brave ones who's decided to do a public presentation. So we also thank Moms for giving us the opportunity and the platform for him to conduct this project in the class. He will be talking about the need for fossil fuel alternatives, and I will move away from the podium and let him get started. Thank you for coming again.
All right, well, like Dr. Gazier said, my name is Gray Harris. I'm a senior legal studies major at Ball State University, and I'm heading to Robert H. McKinney Law School starting in August. During this lecture, feel free to ask any questions. This is a somewhat complex topic. I'm not going to go too deep into the science, but if you have a question, feel free to ask. The world is running out of fossil fuels. In a time of division in American politics, the future of American energy seems uncertain at best. And some politicians advocate investing in wind and solar power, while others simply advocate drilling more oil. The only certainty is that within the next 60 to 100 years, America will deplete its fossil fuel reserves, and it will be too late to start looking for alternative solutions. To fully understand what needs to be done, this study will look at the history of American alternative energy and the paradigm shifts that have come about as we've changed and updated the technologies that we will use to replace fossil fuels. It will also make predictions about what will need to be done for America to be energy independent when fossil fuels are a thing of the past. You'll see I've ordered a lot of the paradigms in American alternative energy by legislation. As a legal studies student, I'm very familiar with legislation, and so my own research focuses mainly on public policy. I find it's a good way to show what the interest in the American public has at the moment in any such topic. So the first piece of legislation that we're going to be talking about, and really the first piece of legislation that influenced American alternative energy technology, was the Federal Water Power Act of 1920. And the act was designed to take advantage of new advancements in the field of hydroelectric energy production. Now, hydroelectric energy was behind the development of such projects as Hoover Dam, which would probably be the most famous example that you'd be familiar with. The law also created a Federal Power Commission, which was tasked with granting permits to new hydroelectric projects and also guaranteed that a certain percent of profits from the dams would go to the state it was located in. And this was as an incentive for states to try and convert a lot of their energy grid into hydroelectric dams. And while hydroelectric dams were certainly successful and rather reliable, they were not necessarily cost effective at the time. And while they are used to some extent today to supplement fossil fuels, they are not actually able to sustainably replace fossil fuels due to the locations of areas that would be suitable for dams and the energy output. This led to a paradigm shift. Obviously, hydroelectric was not going to completely replace fossil fuels, and at the time, fossil fuels, we didn't really know they were running out. So following World War II, the field of nuclear energy became a government concern. And specifically when I'm talking about nuclear energy at this point, we're talking about nuclear fission, which is the process in which, to grossly oversimplify, you take a very large atom and tear it apart into smaller pieces, and this produces energy in the form of radiation and heat, which can be used to heat water, to turn turbines with steam, to produce electricity. The government's interest in developing this nuclear energy led to two acts: the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 and the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. The 1946 legislation determined that nuclear fission technology would be controlled by the civilian population rather than the military. Up until this time, the military was still in charge after the development of the Manhattan Project during World War II. And there was actually a lot of censorship on any component of nuclear technology. So this law shifted over to the civilian population. The 1954 legislation was part of President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. It was made to encourage the development of privately owned nuclear power plants. It set up regulations for these plants regarding waste disposal, and it allowed private citizens to participate or to patent nuclear reactor designs, an act which had been banned under the strict censorship that had followed World War II with the military. The problem that we ran into and that we'll see later as we developed nuclear fission technology is that there's a high risk for meltdown. The common example would be Chernobyl in Russia and that incident. Also, Japan at the Fukushima reactor had a meltdown only a few years ago. It's highly radioactive, it's highly volatile. Also, there's an issue of where to store the waste, which we'll see later becomes a major reason why many people are hesitant to switch to nuclear fission technology. The next federal legislation that we see that's hoping to develop alternative energy is really significant as far as today's current paradigm and the way that it's shifting. It is the Energy Tax Act of 1978. And this legislation had two major functions. Provided funding in the form of tax breaks for private citizens to convert to solar, wind, and geothermal energy production systems. It also set up a gas guzzler tax, which a person paid when they purchased a vehicle which had an official gas mileage that was below certain levels. And this level was adjusted many times over time. This legislation is reflective of modern day attempts to move away from oil to push America toward wind, solar, and geothermal. It was really at this time that the government first takes an interest in wind, solar, and geothermal technologies. And today, we're still trying to develop these technologies, which we've shown will not work to meet our energy needs without the supplement of fossil fuels and cannot meet our needs. Solar energy simply doesn't have the output and to meet our needs in a cost-effective manner. There's a study that shows that you need to convert an equal land mass to the total combined road surfaces of the United States to solar panels to power to meet the power needs of the United States, and this clearly would not be cost effective to the average American household. Wind also shares a similar problem, where just the simple proliferation of these windmills would far exceed the cost effective electricity budgets of most Americans. Geothermal energy seems to be the most promising of these three. However, it has not fully developed because of cost and locations where geothermal energy would be effective. This led us to the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporations Act of 1980. This act created the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporation, which was made to help private business build and develop facilities to make synthetic liquid fuels. So when you hear of ethanol and these sort of biofuels, as they've come to be known, this is really where that began. The corporation was met with strong resistance from politicians who felt the corporation represented government intervention in the capitalist economy. It was deemed an overall failure due to the fact it was unable to meet levels of liquid synthetics required by the legislation. And obviously today we still have biofuels, we're still producing biofuels. However, we're seeing that they may or may not have an impact on the farming community and the prices of crops for the farming community. And there are some side effects that we're concerned with more of in a political and economic scale. Scientifically, it still produces emissions, which is something that we are concerned with climate change. And it's an ineffective replacement for fossil fuels in the long run. We simply can't produce enough of it to completely replace fossil fuels when we run out. In the same year that the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporations Act of 1980 was passed, Congress passed a host of other legislation, including the Biomass Energy and Alcohol Fuels Act of 1980, the Renewable Energy Resources Act of 1980, and the Geothermal Energy Act of 1980, and the Ocean Thermal Energy Conservation Act of 1980. We'll start with the Biomass Energy and Alcohol Fuels Act of 1980. And again, we're promoting biofuels as we know them today. Really, at the time in the 1980s, this was an attempt to reduce American dependency on foreign oil, especially from the Middle East. But again, we simply haven't been able to produce sufficient quantities of biofuels, and they still produce byproducts that we're not really comfortable with. The Renewable Energy Resources Act of 1980. This was an attempt by the government to convince businesses and give them a profit incentive to invest in renewable energy. While it was a laudable goal, again, it didn't have a lot of success, as seems to be the case when the government's trying to lead these businesses along. The Geothermal Act of 1980, this was to go into the research in the field of geothermal energy. As I've already stated, geothermal energy is the most promising of the three traditional, if you will, alternative energy creation methods. However, it still has not been able to show that it can replace fossil fuels. Finally, we have the Ocean Thermal Energy Conservation Act of 1980. And this act was striving to get the private sector to develop what was called ocean thermal energy plants. And basically, these were turbines that were able to harvest, through a rather complex process, electricity from the ocean itself. The reactors were shown to be very delicate, and they didn't really work in a long run scenario, and it ultimately failed. The act was considered a success, however, because it did successfully encourage private industry to develop these generators, even though the generators themselves did not turn out to be of much use. As I mentioned earlier, we ran into problems with the storage of waste from nuclear fission reactions. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 was created with the sole purpose of regulating the storage of nuclear waste. In the largely unregulated environment before this legislation, nuclear waste was being stored on site for many nuclear reactors. Waste from nuclear weapons was being stored on military bases. The legislation was originally intended to survey and set up several locations throughout the United States. The state in which proposed location was given a veto power to say, okay, we're going to veto the federal government putting a nuclear waste disposal plant in our state. And in the end, only one location was approved, and that was Yucca Mountain in Nevada. Nevada now opposes the storage facility, and it claims it was originally under the assumption that other facilities would be built. In reality, Yucca Mountain is the only federal storage facility for nuclear waste, and this causes a lot of problems in and of itself. We have these the rods that are used in these nuclear fission reactors are highly radioactive. We're concerned with their contamination and the sickness of the human population around them. And obviously, it's a political issue because Nevada is not too happy with getting all the waste from the entire nation dumped onto their land. Leads us to the Energy Policy Act of 1992. This act was passed to set energy standards for buildings, electric cars, and promote alternative fuels. It required federal car fleets to have a certain percentage of vehicles on alternative fuels. It promoted competitive development of alternative energy systems with the use of federal funding. It is largely an update of the 1980 legislation that advocated the development of private sector American alternative energy. It has to some degree been successful. However, it still relies heavily on fossil fuels. While there's a certain percentage of this federal car fleet that has to be able to run an alternative, this is in reality meant normally that you have cars that can run on both E85 and traditional fuel. So the successfulness of this legislation is questionable at best. We have the Energy Policy Act of 2005. This legislation was a comprehensive piece of energy legislation that dealt with the entire energy policy of the United States. It does address alternative energy and promotes wind, fission, and other alternative energy through government subsidies. In spite of this, the legislation gives several benefits to traditional fossil fuel industries, such as encouraging drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and exemptions from certain federal environmental legislation. Obviously, this causes significant problems and ties into the biology aspect of this course when we are focusing on expanding any oil drilling and any increased production in fossil fuels, and we cut back on environmental protections that those companies have to follow. And we've seen several accidents in the Gulf in the last few years, which have shown that this was almost certainly a bad decision. And since fossil fuels will be running out within either our lifetime or children's or our grandchildren's lifetime, it seems to be a short-sighted plan. The Energy Improvement and Extension Act of 2008 provided further benefits to the alternative energy industry, including subsidies and tax breaks. However, it focused again on wind, solar, and geothermal projects, which cannot sustain our energy needs without fossil fuels being involved. This led to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. It was better known as the stimulus package that President Obama first was able to pass through Congress when he was elected into office. And the main goal of this legislation was to stimulate the U.S. economy. However, the law provided tax cuts for businesses and homes that became more energy efficient, and it also promoted wind and solar industries, which makes sense. Wind and solar were major backers to the Democratic Party in 2008, so this made logical sense that tax breaks would follow. The history of this legislation shows that America's policy has been streamlined really into two major paths. From the ideological left, there's a promotion to develop wind, solar, and geothermal energy. And on the ideological right, there's the idea and policy of fully depending on fossil fuels and nuclear fission generation. The question is, do either of these approaches provide a full replacement to the current fossil fuel system? And in reality, they do not. Neither path is sufficient to meet our energy needs. As we've discussed, wind, solar, and geothermal by themselves will not be sufficient. And clearly, we're going to be running out of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels, we believe, are damaging to the environment, may contribute to the greenhouse gas effect and global warming and climate change, and obviously is something that we are trying to avoid at this point. And we've also discussed the problem with nuclear fission. While nuclear fission may be able to meet our power needs, there's significant concerns with the safety of the reactors themselves and the safety of storing the waste from those reactors. A paradigm shift that is currently in the process is moving away from these politically entrenched ideas of either keeping fossil fuel traditional energy or supporting these frankly unsustainable alternative energy technologies, is the development of fusion energy. Fusion-based energy is a nuclear energy. However, it's the opposite of what you would see with nuclear fission. Basically, you have two very small atoms, and you're going to smash them together. When you have conditions of significant pressure and significant heat, then you are able to overcome the repulsive forces between these atoms, and they fuse together. This, much like fission, releases energy in the form of heat. However, it does not produce the same radiation that you see in fission reactions, and it does not produce toxic emissions, and it does not produce toxic byproducts, which are serious advantages of fusion-based energy. The government, the United States federal government, that is, has funded two major approaches to develop sustainable fusion reactors that would be cost-effective and be able to meet the American energy need when fossil fuels run out. And that is another benefit of fusion-based energy, is its energy output is actually sufficient to meet our energy needs without any help from fossil fuels in a cost-effective manner. The first thing to note is that nuclear fusion technology relies on plasma physics. In a fusion reaction, atoms of hydrogen are placed in conditions of extreme heat and pressure. In these highly specialized environments, the hydrogen atoms are forced close enough together that the electrostatic force that usually repels them due to their charges is overcome by the strong nuclear force. And this thermal energy can be harnessed to heat water and steam turbines. They're actually, we'll get to even newer fusion technology, which could be put into our current power grid and work today. However, the most advanced nuclear reactor that was being built, if you went back 3 years, would be ITER. And ITER is an international fusion project that the U.S. is helping to fund in conjecture with several other nations. ITER uses the magnetic field to manage reaction plasma. It uses liquid lithium as a coolant. The lithium recycles the expelled electrons to form tritium, or hydrogen-3. Tritium is one of the two forms of hydrogen used as fuel for these reactors. The other is deuterium, or hydrogen-2. The benefits of this type of energy production cannot be understated. It is projected to produce 10 times the energy it takes to make the reaction, and is far safer than fission generators due to a lack of any potential for meltdowns. At the same time, these generators, if commercialized, could easily meet America's energy needs. Unfortunately, this technology has been pushed to the side. There have been significant problems with ITER because it is an international collaboration. There have been problems with other nations and the United States itself not necessarily keeping up with their end of the bargain. It is based on international law, which makes it hard to enforce. And because of that, we've also had quality control issues where we've had parts manufactured in our nation which aren't compatible with parts produced in other nations, and the project's stalled. Also, ITER is projected to, it's based off of what's called a tokamak design, and would not necessarily be as cost effective as some of the other fusion projects that we've seen on the list due to its immense size. It's easily the size of a medium office building. And there are some problems associated with that. The other government-funded fusion energy project is the National Ignition Facility. The National Ignition Facility, or NIF, is partially funded by the United States military, but also funded by through civilian government funding. And it uses a different system to ignite the deuterium into a full fusion reaction. The process called ignition, so it makes the fusion reactor self-sustainable. And it basically, you have multiple lasers, which are all pointed at a deuterium pellet. And once activated, these lasers produce incredibly high temperatures and incredibly high pressure, and will cause ignition. The National Ignition Facility, just last November, became the first active fusion reactor to produce net gain energy. That is, we actually, in real life, rather than in mathematics or on paper, produce more energy than it took to begin the reaction. Unfortunately, the government then responded by cutting the National Ignition Facility's funding. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but that it seems to be the way that it's going. So we're really caught in this paradigm shift where we have fusion technology that can replace fossil fuels when they go out. However, we're still clinging to the old paradigm of wind, solar, geothermal, and nuclear fission, really because it's entrenched within the political mind of the nation. You have lobby groups that can spend vast amounts of money on campaigns in order to get their viewpoints heard, where these fusion developers really don't have the same sort of funds to lobby in DC. And we're seeing this government-funded fusion energy really slowly grab hold as it becomes more and more prominent. A large breakthrough just this year comes from private fusion development, and this comes from the company Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin, I say private company, it is a defense contractor, however, it is independent of the government, so it's private industry, but it is heavily influenced by government military spending at the military contractor. Lockheed Martin has developed what's called a magnetic bottle fusion reactor. And what it does is, as I mentioned, the older reactors were the size of a medium office building. The magnetic bottle is about the size of a tractor-trailer semi-truck and would be able to power an entire city indefinitely. Lockheed Martin is planning on getting their reactor running in experimental form within 10 years within public production in 20. Which means within our lifetime we could see the successful replacement of fossil fuels by clean, sustainable, responsible alternative energy. And really, this will, I believe, if the Lockheed Martin magnetic bottle works, it's going to be what finally completely changes the paradigm permanently. And is it going to be able to completely get us off this notion that we can use wind, solar, or geothermal energy to replace fossil fuels, which is just simply mathematically not true. I believe the current policies that the United States are following are setting us up for failure, the inability to change to these new paradigms. And I believe we need to cultivate the development of private sector fusion power. Until the United States grid can be completely switched to fusion, or if there's another technology, there could very well be another paradigm shift where we discover another alternative energy technology that will be able to replace fossil fuels. We should maximize our production of domestic fossil fuels. And I have references. So in conclusion, what we've seen is that over time we've shifted paradigms for alternative energy. Initially, you could say that the mindset wasn't even the same. Now we're concerned with running out of fossil fuels. At a time, we were just simply looking for alternative ways to produce energy. If you go back to the 1920s with Hoover Dam, hydroelectric development, and the atomic age that started with nuclear fission. However, today we've shifted into a different mentality where alternative energy is no longer a convenience, it's a need as we run out of fossil fuels. And as we see greater and greater effects of climate change due possibly to the use of these fossil fuels. Finally, we've seen the technology itself develop and paradigms change as to what technology will and will not work, and what politically is entrenched and will not, and is unchangeable over time. We've seen with nuclear fission the idea first that it was simply a military technology that can be used to build bombs. Then we see in Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program that we can use it possibly for good. Then we see that it causes problems. There's radioactive fallout. There's waste disposal issues. It ultimately failed. With wind, solar, geothermal, we initially again see maybe this is a technology that can be used to get us off our fossil fuel dependence. However, now that it's been shown not to work, we still have these companies lobbying in DC with great amount of money and keeping this industry going. Similarly with fossil fuel energy production, we've seen how originally it was a good thing. It was able to lead the Industrial Revolution. However, now we can see negative effects and we can see that we're going to run out. And then we're shifting into this new fusion paradigm. And we're going to have to see maybe in the next 20 years with the Lockheed Martin plan, whether or not this is a true shift to a new paradigm where this will be how energy works in the future, or if it's just another step in the journey. Thank you, and I am open for questions. I'm not sure. How do I take questions here off the queue?
Oh, great. Yeah, you don't run the keyboard. The person who's going to talk will follow the timer, and then you just answer in voice, and you take the time that you need.
Gotcha. And then where do I see the question?
Oh, I'll just ask you.
Okay.
On voice. I appreciate taking the time and doing this for us. So I was curious. So you've probably, I mean, in realistic terms, it probably, if the fusion thing took off, it'd be 2050, thereabouts, right? I mean, I know you said 20 years, but I mean, let's say at the earliest 20 years, 2040. What increasing our fossil fuels. Now, I'm glad that you were honest enough to say that the wind and solar thing hasn't worked out. That's an awesome thing. But what are some ways you think that we could, like the Keystone Pipeline? Are you on board with that, or any other ways that we could become energy independent in the next 5 to 10 years while we wait for the next 20 or 30?
That's an excellent question. I definitely think the only way that the United States can become fully energy independent with existing technology would be to find more ways to drill fossil fuels that we have direct control over. The Keystone Pipeline, while there are environmental concerns, would certainly do this. It's really a balancing act of, do we want to drastically expand our fossil fuel drilling and our development, or do we want to shift those resources into making fusion happen more quickly, and try to rely on this fusion development within our lifetimes? And really, I mean, either way works. Either way, we become energy independent. But again, we're going to be running out of fossil fuels in 50 to 60 years. And at that point, we've lost a lot of the investment that we put into that. So while I think it's necessary to some degree to increase our fossil fuels, it has to be balanced with new development into this fusion grid.
Right, but I guess that the only concern with the fusion grid, if I was, because as a layman, not knowing anything about it, would be, are we putting all of our eggs in one basket at that point?
Absolutely. And that is a major concern. And again, that's why I was saying at the end of the lecture, we're just shifting into this fusion paradigm. And on paper, it works. On paper, putting all our eggs in this basket is not a bad call. But as you said, in reality, it can take longer than expected to implement fully this program. Once it's implemented, though, I mean, we're going to be producing greater amounts of energy than our current fossil fuel system at cheaper prices. So it's not a bad basket to have all of our eggs in.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Phoebe Wikifu, who doesn't have a microphone. And her question is, can you speak to the basis for your